Katherine Stewart is an award-winning author. She wrote the book Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy. Her previous book, The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, formed the basis of the documentary feature God and Country, which was produced by Rob Reiner. Stewart's work appears in the New York Times, New Republic, Religion News Service, and many others. So the question is, why have so many Americans turned against democracy? Stewart pulls back the curtain on the inner workings and leading features of a movement that have weaponized disinformation and grievance and turned religion into a tool of domination. Her reporting and political analysis helps frame the conversation about the moral collapse of conservatism in America and points the way towards a democratic future. So please welcome Katherine Stewart.
Really grateful to all of you guys here today, and I'm so grateful to David and Jocelyn and FREEFLO for this gathering. You know, community these days is more important than ever. There's so much happening all at once. Today, at least among those of us who value democracy and its institutions, there is widespread alarm about the direction our country has taken. We're alarmed about the assault on the Constitution and the constitutional principle of church-state separation, and a president who flagrantly violates the law. We're alarmed by the weaponization of the Department of Justice, the war on public education, and the funneling of public money to religious schools and institutions. Free speech, the integrity of voting rights, the legitimacy of the courts, these core principles and institutions and others are under attack. More than anything, we're witnessing, as Kate Cohen mentioned, a war on the truth. One of the first casualties of fact-free hyperpartisanship is competence in government. You can see it in the whole Doge fiasco. What kind of government fires the people who handle nuclear weapons, exposes classified information on semi-functional websites, takes a sledgehammer to consumer protections and air traffic control? How do we get so much incompetence in one place at one time? So that's one, these are some clear lines of alarm, but others are that this administration is laying the groundwork for absolutely epic levels of corruption. Elon Musk, who is the legitimate subject of many investigations for his various business arrangements, is now securing favored deals for himself while gutting the agencies that are investigating him. But of course, our president and his family have been moving with lightning speed to cash in on these opportunities for grift with meme coins and through other memes. And of course, now that the Department of Justice has effectively been decapitated, and of course, the president has been granted by the Supreme Court immunity for anything he pretends is official, this kind of, I would say, heroic levels of graft and corruption will be easier to carry out. You know, I'm starting to notice something that I'm going to call anti-woke derangement syndrome. You know, there's a list of hundreds, literally hundreds of words banned on federal government websites and in their communications, including such supposedly wokety woke words as status, belong, socioeconomic, historically. I mean, this is really what they're doing. You can't use words like expression or disparity. You can't reference mental health or accessible. All of this is coming from the people who lectured us for decades about free speech and supposed canceling. Then there's the brazen attack on science, which I would like to focus on this for a little bit. Have you guys noticed that the budget cutters aren't taking aim at the fossil fuel subsidies and tax breaks for finance people? Instead, they're slashing funding for health research. $800 million from Johns Hopkins alone, I read the other day. the defunding of the NIH, slashing funding for organizations that predict potentially life-threatening weather events and prevent pandemics like Ebola, a Secretary of Health and Human Services who thinks we should all get the measles and treat it with cod liver oil. I mean, what is behind this attack on science? This is just, one small slice of the attack on science. We must remember that Donald Trump rose to power with the determined assistance of a movement that denies science, bashes government, and prioritizes loyalty over professional expertise. Leaders of the Christian right have long seen scientific truths grounded in rational inquiry as their enemy. At least since the 19th century, when the pro-slavery theologian Robert Louis Dabney attacked the physical sciences as, quote, theories of unbelief, this is what he called them, hostility to science has characterized the most extreme forms of religious nationalism in the United States. Today, climate denialism is mainstream in the MAGA movement. Among the federal government's new list of banned phrases are clean energy, climate science, environmental quality, and pollution. These words are supposed to be scrubbed from government websites and public-facing communications. Some leaders of the Christian nationalist movement, like those allied with the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation, it's a sort of far-right think tank that has denounced environmental science as a, quote, cult of the green dragon, this is what they call it. They cast environmentalism as an alternative and false theology. They literally say a concern about the environment is a religion. Religious nationalism has brought to American politics the conviction that our political differences are a battle between absolute evil and absolute good. When you're engaged in a struggle between the so-called party of life and what they say is the party of death, as some of them now frame our political divisions, you don't need to worry about crafting careful policy based on expert opinion and analysis. Only a heroic leader, free from the scruples of political correctness, can save the righteous from the damned. Fealty to the cause and to a lawless leader is everything. Fidelity to the facts means nothing. But again, what's the deeper reason for all of this? Well, democracy itself relies on specialized knowledge. It relies on expertise and rational accountability to function. Trump's people understand intuitively that this kind of rationality is inimical to dictatorial power. So they've set about destroying centers of expertise within the government, as well as slashing scientific research, health research, and expertise at public and private universities. A disinformed public is easier to control, easier to manipulate, and they've continued to lie and spread disinformation as vigorously as possible. Very simply, they understand that the truth is their enemy. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I've documented the rise of Christian nationalism and the Christian nationalist movement and the Anti-Democracy Coalition for 16 years and through 3 books. Now, some of you do already know my origin story about how I got interested in this field 16 years ago when something called a Good News Club came to my daughter's public elementary school in Santa Barbara, California. So I'm not going to repeat that story here. My latest book, Money, Lies, and God, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, is the latest, my latest book in the culmination of a decade and a half of research. The most important thing I've observed over time is how much the Christian nationalist movement has evolved. The core ideology really hasn't changed, but its appeal and strategy has broadened to a massive degree, and now its leaders are saying the quiet part out loud. They used to sort of pretend they just wanted a seat at the noisy table of American democracy, and now they are really very overtly anti-democratic, and they talk about their aims to dominate every aspect of government and society quite openly. And when I started researching this movement 16 years ago, a lot of sort of media voices sort of scratched their heads and said, what are you talking about? This is a movement that could fit into a phone booth. The big story in religion reporting was the rise of the nuns. So everybody assumed that this, or many people assumed this movement would largely fade into disexistence and it would just fade out and die. But now its influence over one of America's two major political parties is indisputable. 16 years ago, it was clear that the leaders behind the fundamentalist indoctrination program targeting my daughter's public school were exploiting religion to pursue a political agenda that was profoundly at odds with American democracy. But this organization, I realized, is just one small component of a leadership-driven, organization-driven political machine. The movement's legal ecosphere is one of its most vital features. It is tactical. It is extremely well-funded. I mean, the amounts of money that flow through the right-wing legal ecosphere are hard to comprehend. They're just so vast. Hundreds of millions of dollars every year, sort of to shape the courts, because leaders know if you can shape the courts, you can shape the country. So they're really long range in their thinking, and they're working toward a redefinition of the idea of religious liberty that aims to turn civil rights law on its head. In recent years, the movement has broadened its base of donors. It's substantially increased its power and made inroads among new populations. Jasper mentioned the Amish. This movement had leadership that actually went after the Amish to turn them out to vote, and they were quite successful. They are, very successful at turning out their base, but they're also always looking for new populations or low propensity voters to evangelize with their untruths. Movement leaders used to feel, again, that they had to hide their belief that only Christians of a certain type, a reactionary type, should dominate all the key features of government and society. How many of you guys have heard of the 7 Mountains Mandate? Quite a number of you. It's the idea that only Christians of a certain type should dominate the 7 mountains or molders of culture, including finance, government, media, education, and the like. And now they're really pretty open about it. At religious right conferences I've attended, speakers sneer at Christians, fellow Christians, who emphasize Jesus' teachings of social justice, dismissing them as, quote, woke heretics, false prophets, and even agents of Satan. So yes, non-believers are, of course, number one scapegoat in the sort of faith sphere, right, as you might call it. But progressive Christians are also coming under attack, along with certain religious minority groups. Perhaps the most pernicious aspect of this movement is the mainstreaming of lies and bad faith arguments. Many representatives of the movement have convinced themselves that any means justifies the end when it comes to achieving supposedly godly rule. For this reason, they're funding and working with massive disinformation and propaganda operations, which I discuss in detail in Money, Lies, and God. So I want to break down the title of my new book, Money, Lies, and God, because it explains a bit about how we got here. First, money is a huge part of the story, meaning that huge concentrations of wealth have destabilized the political system in some really interesting ways, which I'll get into in a bit. Second, lies or conscious disinformation is another huge feature of this movement. And third, God, because the most important ideological framework for the largest part of this movement is Christian nationalism. And I chose the subtitle, Inside the Movement to Destroy American Democracy, because the conclusion I draw from 16 years of reporting on the subject is that this movement is intrinsically nihilistic or destructive. It's much more animated by what they want to destroy rather than what they create. And what they create is always sort of hearkening to some fantasy of an American past that never actually existed. It's really, fantasy. So let's talk about money. In this book, I pay huge attention to a group I call the funders. These are a subset of the beneficiaries of the huge upward concentration of wealth over the past decades. And they're largely motivated by a desire to advance their interests and protect their privileges. They're, typically informed by some kind of libertarian or pseudo-libertarian ideology. Some of the funders are also driven by more overtly religious or cultural goals. I'm talking about people like, I'll just throw out some names here. The Corkerys. I get into a lot of these folks in Money, Lies, and God. You can look at Barry Side, or the Corkerys, or Sean Filer, or members of the Betsy DeVos Prince family juggernaut, right? Or Tim Dunn, or the Wilkes brothers. Religiously, these folks are all over the place. Some are evangelical, some are ultra-conservative Catholic, some are Jewish, some are various types of Protestant. Some are frankly atheistic, even if they don't identify as atheists. Religiously, they're really all over the place, but they're really united in their determination to destroy democracy, essentially. And they are devoting their money to the deep organizational infrastructure of the Christian nationalist movement, because they know it's going to get them the votes that they need from the rank and file to get them the economic policies that they want. So many of the, when I mention that deep organizational infrastructure, this movement is both leadership-driven and organization-driven. And these organizations can be, the power of the movement is in that deep organizational infrastructure. The organizations can be divided into categories. There's the legal sphere I mentioned. They've got networking organizations. They've got think tanks. They've got very political pastors that, they help turn out the vote. They've got, a far-right disinformation sphere, very sophisticated data initiatives. And many of the leaders, or as I call them, power players, sort of heading up these different organizations, themselves are making serious money by promoting these kinds of authoritarian ideas. So that's the sort of money and the lies. A lot of the funders are also investing their wealth in a whole set of media empires and operations whose business model is essentially to spread different sorts of disinformation and conspiracism for profit. But Christian nationalism is, I would say, arguably the single most important piece of the anti-democratic reaction. And it's got that central role because for the rank and file, for the ordinary voter, it's a key way of legitimizing their support for the anti-democratic movement. This movement sets itself quite clearly against the Constitution and America's democratic ideals, but leaders of the movement need to square this with people who have been brought up to believe themselves to be patriotic. And the ideology of Christian nationalism does that. The key thing to keep in mind is that Christian nationalism is not simply an explanation for what they're doing, it is also a rationalization strategy. It's like, people who sort of understand that they're breaking the system can be made to believe that they're doing something good for this country if they've been told over and over again by their leaders that this is the way to be patriotic, that our country is on the brink of an apocalypse due to secularists and liberals and a woke elite, and therefore you need to sort of put your faith in a dictator who's not going to follow the rules, who's going to break the law because he's going to save us from the sort of demonic or satanic threat that they face. This rank and file has to be distinguished from the small cadre of leaders or political pastors and national activists who are often driving the agenda. I think those political pastors are often, their role is underestimated. They are often drawn, I describe this in detail in my book, Money, Lies, and God. Pastors, conservative-leaning pastors, are drawn into networks such as Faith Wins and Watchmen on the Wall, and they're brought into presentations by high-level leaders, sometimes dozens of pastors, and in some cases hundreds of pastors, and they're told you got to get your congregations out to vote their biblical values, and these are the biblical values they should care about. Then they're given incredibly sophisticated materials like voter guides, instructions for forming teams within their churches that will reach out to fellow congregants and tell them specifically how to vote, videos to air at church, data tools that pastors can use to figure out who voted in the last election and things like that. So in a country where 40 to 50% of people don't turn out to vote, and an additional number have their votes essentially stolen from them due to race-based gerrymandering and other sort of dirty tactics, you don't need a majority to win elections. All you need is to disproportionately mobilize minority. They know if you can swing a district in a swing state, you can swing an election. So they really devote a lot of effort to those, districts, those very key districts. For years, movement leaders have articulated a vision of America that is deeply un-American. It includes the idea that the US is founded not on any specific principles, but on a specific religion and cultural heritage. It is the idea that America is on the brink of an apocalypse due to the rise of equality and what they call wokeness and the radical left. It's the idea that democracy won't be able to supply, won't be able to solve our problems, and the idea that the rules don't apply anymore, and what we need is a strong man, an authoritarian leader who puts himself above the law, and who's going to seize the reins of power, scrap the rule of law in favor of the iron fist. And it's these ideas that are getting spread through these hyper-political pastors over and over, and sort of making the rank and file believe that they have no other choice but to vote for a lawless dictator, which is not how they see it, of course, but how anyone who sort of is observing what's happening in our government is able to see it. So in sum, it's this idea that democracy, in the sense of a government as representative of the people and respecting individual rights in an irreducibly pluralistic society, it's a sense that this kind of government simply doesn't work. So you need to smash it up and create something new, an autocracy. So that's the contours of the idea. I hope I make it clear in Money, Lies, and God that this is emphatically not the idea of Thomas Jefferson or Frederick Douglass or Abraham Lincoln or so many others who actually helped create the America as we know it. It is as un-American as it gets. America was the first major state founded on an idea, not on a tradition, not on a specific heritage or religion. It's the idea that all people are created equal and that we should be governed by laws that are deliberated in public and apply equally to all. It's the idea of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, of course, these ideals have not been applied consistently over time. It's important to recognize that the authoritarian tendency and reactionary movements have a long history in America. And so this is not coming out of nowhere. This has always been there right from the beginning. As soon as the US established itself as a democratic republic, people pushed for monarchy, some people, and concentration of power. And that strain has been with us ever since. That said, there's a long history on the other side too. So it is false to say just because there is one important strand in US history that there has been no other. There have always been progressive movements that sought to deliver greater forms of justice and greater forms of equality. And these two strains have always existed in some tension. Yes, there were religious leaders who legitimized and defended the institution of slavery, but there were also religious movements as well as non-religious or I would say heretic kind of conscience movements that opposed it. You know, some argued for the end of slavery from pulpits, and some really broke from religious orthodoxy altogether and argued for greater forms of equality, and they ultimately prevailed. So yes, there has been extraordinary corruption, but America has also nurtured a free press that has sought to bring the corruption to light and hold its perpetrators to account. We have seen a civil rights movement and a women's rights movement and equality movements of various types that have delivered freedom and a measure of rights for Americans that have inspired similar movements in other parts of the world. Again, our history is far from perfect, but we can recognize that the democratic ideals of pluralism, of equality, and justice are beautiful ideals, and they remain worth fighting for. So, you know, here's something else I really want to discuss, because it's on my mind. What do we make of Trump's declarations about invading and annexing Greenland, Canada, and Panama? You guys laugh. I mean, when he says Canada's going to be the 51st state, should we, or he's going to, you know, send soldiers to Greenland? I mean, how seriously do we take this? Seriously. You know, we take it seriously because it follows a classic pattern with the rise of authoritarian leaders. He's not the first. You know, it's not particularly logical, but it happens. They need to channel their own aggression as well as the aggression, and they need to focus the rage of their constituents on both internal and external objects. So we've seen how he's done it internally. You know, the way I do a lot of my research is I go to right-wing conferences and strategy gatherings and rallies, unfortunately, and at every time I've seen Trump speak, he says, our greatest threat to America is not from our enemies on the outside, as dangerous they may be. The greatest threat is from within. And so he's, you know, dividing Americans between the pure versus the impure, the insiders versus the outsiders, the good versus the evil, and apparently we're the evil, right? But they also have to, these authoritarian leaders have to, you know, long history of engaging in these futile expansionist projects. So they have to focus some of that rage on the outside. And I'm afraid that Greenland and Canada and Panama are falling victim to the same malevolent forces that are also attacking American democracy. I don't think there's that much coherent thinking at play. He and his allies are flooding the zone with wildly aggressive moves. It's an intimidation strategy, so they can get what they really want. Trump and his allies want grift, they want money and power. His theocratically minded allies and supporters are looking forward to a dictatorial arrangement where they will get to impose their values and their culture wars on the rest of the population. Now, to be sure, they may say there's a logic to the trade wars. They may say they need to get better negotiation positions on, say, water rights in Canada. But those negotiations would have been much more successful, by the way, had they been done without the dramatic hissy fits and juvenile declarations. So they're really just another means of entrenching dictatorial power and frankly degrading the status of America around the world. It's really very sad. We also can't forget that a lot of what he does is performative. He's showing the world that he's the one making decisions, he's the big guy calling the shots. Because in truth, as far as I can tell, nobody in America really wants this. For a long time, America's conservatives claimed to stand up for Western civilization against weak-kneed liberals. But now these defenders of the West, these supposed defenders of the West, have abandoned every Western value worth keeping. They have thoroughly alienated the allies who share our values and jumped into bed with a murderous dictator whose economy is smaller than that of Canada. I am speaking, of course, about Russia. I mean, the history is relevant because the main points to grasp are that this realignment has very deep roots in America's new authoritarian movement. It springs in part from a certain worldview applied to foreign relations. America's sort of authoritarian movement has a very dark view of international relations. They don't really believe in friendship. Everything is about power and transactions. And also, a sector of that movement has a very strong affinity for Russia and the Russian model of politics. And this is where the history is actually surprising but also revealing. Despite the fact that America's conservatives were very hawkish during the Cold War, there was a sector of the movement that branched off into and kind of admired aspects of the Russian authoritarian system. They bonded over the rejection of liberal values, what they called the homosexual agenda. Both sides promoted Christian nationalism. And so collaboration by both US and Russian activists on culture war issues led to a further expansion of what they called a pro-family cause, which includes restrictions on the rights of women, sexual minorities, certain restrictions on free speech, through groups like the International Organization of the Family, which was set up by American cultural warriors along with their Russian counterparts. And this interesting axis has served to empower, I would say, reactionary and anti-liberal forces around the world as well that are funded by some of the same international sources. So, I would say I'm going to start concluding here and then talk a little bit about what is to be done, because there's so much to do. I would say in conclusion, the government toward which the Trump administration is evolving looks more and more like the kind of government that Putin runs, a cronyistic kleptocracy where the people who are closest to the top boss are the ones who can claim a share of the resources effectively stolen from the public. It's pretty much what America's founders rebelled against, and not the democratic republic they hope to establish. So again, what is to be done? I want to conclude, there's so much in play right now. A lot of people are feeling overwhelmed, and they simply don't know what to do. So I have a whole section at the end of Money, Lies, and God, where I really get into some more detailed recommendations. Don't have time to get into all of them here. But the first step is to get off the couch. When the Trump coalition lost in 2020, they didn't get into bed and suck their thumbs, right? They did some things that those of us who believe in democracy would never want to do, like spread lies and disinformation, deny the consequences of results of a legitimately decided election, and inspire political violence and organize it. We wouldn't want to do that at all. But what they did is they were determined to get out their base. They were determined to go after low propensity voters. They were determined to campaign not just at the end of the election cycle, but all throughout the year. They found new populations to turn out to vote. And we need to do that too. There is, Ralph Reed is one of the movement's very sort of seasoned strategists, or power players as I would call him. And I remember him at an event, he said, pay no attention to the polls, our numbers are shrinking. All that matters is who turns out on election day. And he is right. I think there was so much effort in this last few years to go after the potentially flippable sort of, Christians or conservatives who might still have be gettable. And that's fine. But if you're like me, you can spend a decade or more bashing your head against the wall trying to speak to someone maybe it's a family member, I'm not going to be specific here, and get nowhere. And meanwhile, you will have more, I would say, might be better use of your energy if you go after people who, would vote, but maybe are a little on the fence about it, or can't vote because they're busy raising kids or taking care of elders, or can't drive and might need like a a ride to the poll, like really work at getting out the base. That is like absolutely number one. And going after people who feel disenchanted. Help them understand that voting is basic chess. You're not going to love everything about the candidate. This leads to another point, which is we really need a big tent. We're not going to agree on everything. And frankly, we probably shouldn't agree on everything. There are a lot of fissures on the right. And I think those fissures, we're going to start seeing them come into view. I talk about them more in Money, Lies, and God, but what I started to hear at right-wing conferences was speakers say, they would paraphrase Ronald Reagan, they would say, the person who agrees with you 80% of the time is your 80% friend, not your 20% enemy. And they're saying this because they understand there's no victory without unity. There's another thing they say. They understand that they have no power unless they hold together. And that is true for us too. The right is very good at finding issues to divide a democratic coalition, a pro-democracy movement, and then amplifying those issues in order to split, to create splits. And we've seen this over time. And I think that we need to get better at identifying when there's an issue that's being amplified or a very loud sort of voice that's being amplified that's aiming to split us or aiming to, I would say, dampen enthusiasm for voting altogether. A voice that's saying, oh, both sides are terrible, so there's no point in voting. A lot of that is coming, frankly, from the right or from, by the way, a lot of that is coming from international forces that want to weaken our country and not strengthen us. So we need to stop with the purity tests and really have a big tent. 3, I think it's local activism is so important. This is something we can all do. I'm in awe of what FREEFLO has done. If you look at the involvement in city councils and school boards and so many other areas, it's really critical to get engaged locally. And finally, we need to support democracy-building organizations and institutions. There are so many avenues out there. There are so many avenues for engagement. Some people say to me, like, what should I do? I'm like, well, when you want to buy a winter coat, do you just go to the store and buy the first coat you see, or do you do a little research? I mean, it's very important to figure out who you are, what your values are, which organizations would benefit most or chime with your values or your particular interests, and get involved. And when you get involved with others and join together in a project of building democracy and building a democratic coalition, there's nothing more meaningful and rewarding. So that's all I have time for, and I just want to thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak with all of you.